Hey, hi everyone. This video is for your Learn Day on Monday, May 18th. We're going to continue talking about evolution, and we're going to start off by just reviewing some of the responses that you guys gave me for the Plato's Cave allegory. I'm just going to read a couple of your responses out loud to share. What does the cave represent? The cave represents what's keeping the prisoners away from reality, both literally and figuratively. It shields them from any knowledge of whether or not what they are seeing is real, how large it is, and what it actually is. The sun or light represents all the information in the world that there is to be learned. When one of the prisoners left the cave, everything he saw blinded him at first, but as he spent more time in the sun and light, he explored more and adapted to the brightness. Plato was trying to say that if we don't find answers for ourselves, we will stay comfortable with lies. This relates back to our discussion on beliefs, facts, and scientific literacy, because we need to be willing to listen to what's said on the side of those who believe in evolution, and after educating ourselves accordingly, we can come to a fair conclusion on the topic for ourselves. How might this allegory be relevant today? I got a lot of different responses to this that were really creative. I'm just going to share one. So the student said that in society today, there tends to be a lot of bias, whether it is within politics, race, religion, etc. People hear about the different stereotypes about different groups of people, and when they meet somebody of the description of the stereotype is supposed to be about, they automatically assume that person will be like the stereotype. Sometimes they will not take the time to actually get to know the person before assuming who that person is. If people took the time to do this, to get to know people personally, people would get along better with one another. So I think this really does describe what Plato was trying to say, because he's basically proposing the idea that we are all in a cave in some aspect of our lives because we have a limited perspective, we have limited access to information, so that keeps us from understanding the whole picture. If we are unwilling to learn from other people who have different perspectives, that keeps us in this cave of this limited perspective where we don't have all the information we need to really understand an issue. We're going to use that as a segue just to start talking about Charles Darwin, who's known as the father of modern biology, because Plato's cave is definitely an appropriate allegory for his life and his work. He was the first person to describe the theory of evolution in his book called The Origin of Species, which he published about 160 years ago. He had an interesting life. He came from a wealthy family. His father was a doctor, and he wanted Charles to also be a doctor, so he sent him to medical school. When he got there, he discovered that he was absolutely terrified of blood, and he thought that the lectures were really boring. He wasn't interested in anatomy. It's not what he wanted to study. So he stopped going to class and dropped out of medical school, and his father was very upset with him. What he wanted to do was he wanted to study nature. So he loved insects, he loved birds, he loved different animals, and that's what he wanted to do with his life. But his father told him that was not a reasonable career choice, so he was going to need to do something else. So then he ended up going to Cambridge, where he started to study to become a priest. When he was studying for the priesthood at Cambridge, he met a group of other young men who were also really interested in studying nature. So there he continued to, document and learn about science and learn about different organisms during his time at Cambridge. When he was getting close to graduation, he had the opportunity to go on a voyage, on a ship voyage called the HMS Beagle. The goal of this voyage was to go to undocumented areas of the world and basically map them out. So they were visiting just different islands around the world, and they were making maps of the locations that they went. And they wanted a biologist on the ship just to document the different life forms that they came across. So when he was on this voyage, he was taking specimens, he was preserving them, he was taking all kinds of notes and writing down his theories on the ship about everything that he was seeing. The drawing here is from one of his notebooks. It says, "I think," and you can see this sort of tree that's drawn out here. So his idea of evolution was that evolution is descent with modification, and over time species change and give rise to new species that share a common ancestor. So he believed that all things came from a common origin, and over time there was these differences that eventually led to new species. So he came to that conclusion after viewing all kinds of animals. One of the really formative animals he saw was on the Galapagos Islands off the coast of Ecuador. There's these groups of birds called finches. They look very similar, but they had slight differences in their beak shape. So Darwin noticed that the birds that ate small seeds on islands that had a lot of small seeds had very small beaks that were appropriate for those seeds. He noticed that islands that had larger seeds, those finches tend to have larger beaks that were great for cracking those seeds open. So he came up with this idea that, there was originally just one type of bird, one type of finch, and then over time, depending on what food source was present on the different islands, the ones with the more appropriate beak would survive and reproduce more, and then you would see a speciation or a new species evolve that was appropriate for the particular food source on the island in which it lived. Okay, so like I said, he published this theory about 160 years ago, but he waited 20 years to publish it because he knew this went against all of the current teaching in biology, and he was really afraid that he would be so heavily criticized that he was hesitant to publish this at all. And he was heavily criticized for publishing this theory because it went against current teachings. So this really reminds me of the Plato's cave allegory, just because when he came up with this new idea, people were immediately defensive and they were not welcoming this new information because it didn't go along with their current worldview. So now we're going to watch a video about Darwin's finches today. There's these two scientists from Princeton that currently live in the Galapagos, and they're studying the finches that made Darwin come up with this theory in the first place. So we're going to watch this video now.
Our planet has millions of species, over 300,000 beetles alone, 17,000 butterflies, thousands of mammals, fish, and birds, all astonishingly different. How did so many species come to be? To seek insights into that question, researchers are focusing on places where species recently arose, such as the remote Galapagos Islands.
Scientists are making observations and conducting experiments that would have surprised Charles Darwin. And they're discovering new insights into what the great naturalist called the mystery of mysteries: how new species form.
The Galapagos Islands are one of the most spectacular landscapes in the world, home to a variety of species that live nowhere else. Biologists Peter and Rosemary Grant have been seeking answers to how species arise by focusing on one of the smaller islands, called Daphne Major.
When we started out, we had no plan for the long term. In fact, we thought it was just going to be just a few years, maybe 2 years.
2 years have turned into a 40-year odyssey. The Grants have returned every summer since 1973.
Oh, doesn't matter. So 3 or 6? That's 3 or 6.
Here, they've made some of the most remarkable observations in the history of field research as they studied the famed Galapagos finches. The finches were first brought to scientists' attention by Charles Darwin, when his voyage around South America brought him to this cluster of islands, 600 miles from mainland Ecuador. These volcanic islands are geologically young. They began rising from the ocean floor less than 5 million years ago. At first devoid of life, they now support a modest number of species. Among them, 13 species of finches, found in various combinations on the different islands. The birds live in diverse habitats.
The islands are very different from each other. They differ in size, they differ in topography, and in height.
Larger trees grow at higher elevations, while low islands have mostly cactus, grasses, and shrubs. In these diverse habitats, the finches have evolved many ways to survive.
So, Rosemary, what's the important difference between these birds?
This little warbler finch with its very fine needle-like beak is perfect for picking off insects. This one is the woodpecker finch with a rather more robust beak. It concentrates on beetle larvae and termite larvae. Then we have the cactus finch with a much longer, sharp pointed beak which probes into cactus flowers. And then these three species are the large, medium, and small ground finches. So, Sean, the basic idea is the beaks are tools, and you need the right tool for the right job.
The finches look so different that Darwin first mistook them for entirely unrelated kinds of birds. How did the Galapagos end up with so many species of finches?
In terms of the actual history of the finches of the Galapagos, there were many different possibilities. Different kinds of finches could have all come from the mainland separately, or the finches could have all evolved out there on the islands. And what do we know about that?
Well, now we know from DNA evidence that all of the finches are more related to each other than any one is to a species on the mainland. And that tells us only one species arrived on the archipelago and diversified into the 13 species that we see nowadays in the Galapagos. So they've all come from a single common ancestor.
The question then becomes, how did one ancestral population give rise to many different species, each adapted to a different lifestyle? A crucial insight into how adaptation occurs came when the grants focused on one species on the island of Daphne Major.
A factor of great convenience for us was the small size of the island. That meant that we could walk all over the place.
Oh, there's a bird.
I'll leave that one to you.
The idea was that if we worked really hard, we could follow every individual or almost every individual.
They rose at 5:30 each morning to net the island's medium ground finches.
The beak net is
They measured the size and shape of each bird's beak, the bird's weight, and they tagged them for identification.
the male is 17418.
Year after year they returned, at times tracking over 1,000 finches.
So here's an example of a bird we know intimately over the whole of its lifespan. The number is 5960. We know how many times it bred, which years it bred in, how many mates it had, how many offspring it produced, and then how many of those offspring themselves survived long enough to breed.
Over the first 4 years, little seemed to change. Then in 1977, a terrible drought began.
Virtually no rain fell for the next 18 months.
The vegetation practically disappeared, apart from a few trees without any leaves, and of course the cactus bushes were still there.
Now the medium ground finches had to compete for scarce food.
They started off with a big food supply of small seeds, medium seeds, large seeds. As these small seeds became very scarce, they had to turn increasingly to the large and hard seeds. Well, only birds with large beaks can crack open these woody, spiny fruits.
The the birds with the smallest beaks had the most trouble.
They were scraping about amongst the rocks, and their plumage got so worn that they could barely fly.
That year, over 80% of the medium ground finches died.
We would go around looking for birds that had died, and it's very sad to pick up a bird and say 3972. Oh no, not that bird. Oh.
When they inventoried the surviving medium ground finches, they discovered that one trait had made the greatest difference between life and death.
Well, I'm showing here a distribution of beak depths of the population in 1976. The survivors of this group are shown in black.
Oh. So the larger the beak, the better your chances.
The larger the beak, the higher the likelihood of surviving through the drought of 1977. 18.6 grams.
When they looked at the offspring, they found an even greater surprise. The average beak depth was more than 4% larger than the previous generation. Natural selection had changed the average beak size. Could you have ever imagined measuring and observing something like this on such a short time scale until you actually did it?
When we started, the answer is no. We could not imagine we would be able to do it.
But was this a fluke? Or are changes like this happening all the time? 5 years later, in 1983, an unusually strong El Nino brought 10 times more rain than normal. And the island was overrun by vines that covered even the cactus. The rains changed the vegetation on the island, such that 2 years later, when drought struck, larger seeds became scarce. The birds with larger beaks now had difficulty picking up the more abundant food, the small seeds produced by the vines. That year, many more finches with small beaks survived, and their offspring inherited smaller beaks.
So the selection had swung in the opposite direction, and evolution had occurred as a result.
In an amazingly short period of time, the grants had measured evolution of beak size not once, but twice, demonstrating that when birds encounter different environments, they will change over a very short amount of time.
Okay, so that's as far as we're going to watch in the video for today. Basically what that's showing is the same birds that Darwin observed on his voyage of the beagle are still evolving today, and we can actually watch the evolution occurring in a very short amount of time. So there's basically just 3 tenets that explain evolution. I asked you about these 3 things in the survey, if you're able to observe them, if you agree that these are observable phenomena. And because these 3 things occur, we know that evolution happens. So the first one is that traits are heritable. So often parents will have genetic information that causes a certain physical trait in them and in their offspring. So they can pass traits to their offspring through their genes. That's tenet number 1. Traits are heritable. Tenet number 2 is that offsprings will vary in the traits that they have. So when parents, give rise to offspring, they're not all going to be identical. There's going to be some variation there in the traits that the offspring have. Tenet number 3 are that some of them die. So not every offspring will survive. There is a lack of food, a lack of habitat, a lack of mates. Whatever it is, it prevents the offspring from surviving and producing new offspring. So because of that, there's going to be difference in the traits that are inherited. So the more beneficial the trait is, the more likely it will be to be passed on to the next generation. So just like in the example of the finches, if the only food source available is big, hard seeds, that means that the offspring that have large beaks are more likely to survive and produce more offspring, again, with large beaks. Okay, so over time, the frequency of genes change in a population depending on which genes are best suited for the environment that those offspring are born into. All right, so this is Darwin's conclusions here. In a population, some individuals will have inherited traits that help them to survive and reproduce given the conditions of the environment, such as the predators and the food sources present. The individuals with helpful traits will leave more offspring in the next generation than their peers, since the traits make them more effective at surviving and reproducing. Because the helpful traits are heritable, and because organisms with these traits leave more offspring, the traits will tend to become more common or present in a larger fraction of the population in the next generation. Over generations, the population will become adapted to its environment, as individuals with traits helpful in that environment have constantly greater reproductive success than their peers. So this is the crux of Darwin's theory of evolution. Throughout this week, we're going to go through the different lines of evidence that support his theories. So we see evidence of evolution in the genetic record and the fossil record, through embryology, comparative anatomy, direct observation, like the video just showed. You can see evolution occurring on a small scale, and then also through biogeography. So we'll get into those lines of evidence throughout the week, and we'll talk about how that supports Darwin's theories. Okay, that's it for today. Thank you for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. Like I said, I'm available 11 to 12 for audio conferencing, and then I'm also available outside that time, 2 to 4, and then if you want to set up an appointment, I'm happy to do that. All right, have a good day. Bye.